What are your thoughts in anticipation of Mass resuming June 1st? It's coming up pretty quick.
Yeah, well, the first thing I'd want to say is I'm really looking forward to this. I mean, it's going to be complicated. The guidelines are rather strict and stringent. But the bottom line is that after 2 months of not being able to come to have some public celebration of the Mass, we can do so. The bishops all along have been monitoring the health advisories that have come forth from the province, from the chief medical officer. And we made the decision early on, right from the beginning, that anything that we do in terms of liturgical directives will align with those health and safety measures to keep our people safe. That's why we made the decision early on no longer to have a public celebration of Mass until everybody gets their heads around this virus and how it's transmitted and the danger of it and so on, that our healthcare system has everything in place that it needs to be able to manage all of this. But now that the public relaunch strategy has started, even in phases, then the bishops stepped back and said, all right, how are we going to work along with this to start having a gradual resumption of Mass in a public forum with our people? So there's the heart of it, return to the public celebration of Mass. And for me, that can't be anything but exciting after this 2-month fast, if you will, from receiving the actual body of the Lord.
Can you talk a little bit about the meetings that the task force has had in preparation for this, and what are some of the challenges that you and Bishop McGrattan
Yeah. So we realized this is going to be a complicated process, and so the bishops, under the, represented by myself and Bishop McGrattan, established this task force. And the task force was 4 priests from Edmonton, 4 priests from Calgary, accompanied by 2 medical specialists. They didn't come to every meeting, but they were on call, as it were, should we need to consult with them. And we did quite a bit. So we talked an awful lot about what do we need to do, first of all, to understand the guidelines that are put out by the government to keep us safe. How do we align all of that with liturgical practices so that we're balancing 2 things, keeping people safe and having a worthy and a reverent celebration of the Eucharist, because it always remains the Mass and therefore worthy of our full respect and reverence and so on. Anybody who reads the guidelines will see that there's a lot of detail there. A couple of things that we really spent a lot of time with because we realized it would be important. The first was fair access. Right? If the limit, as it is now in stage 1, is just 50 people, well, that includes the priests, the new liturgical ministers, the ushers, cleaners, and so on. So the actual number of parishioners will be actually less than 50. And when you have, well, it doesn't matter what size congregation, that means coming up with some kind of system of fair and equitable access. We can't just have everybody show up and expect a seat. It's not going to work that way. And yet, in our parishes, there's different levels of resources. A lot of parishes, because the donations have just fallen right off, they've had to lay off temporarily a lot of staff. So they may not have staff any longer to answer the phone, to pick up emails, or whatever. So they're going to have to work out some sort of a system, and we decided to leave it to the creativity of the parishes themselves. They know their own local situation. Come up with some kind of system, maybe of sign-up, pre-registration, work with your pastoral council. What is the fairest, most equitable way in which we can have everybody who wants to come to Mass get to Mass? Now that's going to mean, obviously, that not everybody can expect to get to Mass daily again, get to Mass every Sunday. That's just not going to be workable if we want to have fair access for everybody. So along with whatever system they come up with for pre-registration, we're keeping in place the dispensation from Sunday obligations so that people recognize they're not obliged to come to Mass, especially if they're feeling nervous about coming to Mass or they're in a category that really they ought not to be coming to Mass and so on. That was one complicated issue, and in fact, it remains to be seen how that's all going to work out. This is going to probably be messy for a little while. The other delicate issue is the reception of Holy Communion. And the bishops have made the determination here in Alberta that we will be distributing communion for reception only under the one species, the body of Christ. We won't be distributing the precious blood. And reception will be in the hand only, not on the tongue. Now that's a very sensitive, delicate matter for a lot of people who choose only to receive on the tongue. And it's their right to make that choice. The Church is very clear. They have a right to receive communion only on the tongue. But the bishops also recognize that in law, we have the responsibility as bishops to direct the exercise of those rights for the sake of the common good. So it means that in different circumstances, the bishop may have to decide that for the sake of the common good, temporarily to restrict a particular right that is accorded by the Church to the faithful. Well, certainly based on the preponderance of the most recent medical advice we have heard about the way that the virus is carried, it's very clear to us that this is an occasion in which we have to exercise our responsibility and restrict the exercise of this particular right, reception of communion on the tongue, for a temporary period. So we're asking people to be very, very patient and understanding of this, and to take this in that spirit of charity and concern for their brothers and sisters. The common good issue here is the health and the safety of everybody. So I would say those were the two things that we had the most back and forth on. Probably some others that I'm not thinking of right now because there's so many details.
Are you concerned that there will be a patchwork system of signing up for Mass, depending on which parish?
Oh, it will be patchwork. I think everybody recognizes that, and bishops across the country recognize that. So, and patchwork also in the sense of timing, because we're saying June 1st as the start date, but we're saying specifically it's the earliest date. The guidelines are rather complicated and they're stringent, and the bishops are saying to any pastor, until you are able to meet these conditions fully, you may not begin to have public celebration of Mass. So some parishes may take longer than others to get this in place. So some might be able to start June 1st. Some may not. Some take a little bit longer. And certainly in terms of access, some parishes will still have a whole lot more resources than others, so they could maybe have an online portal for people to connect to the parish with, maybe email, phone, or whatever, to make a good pre-registration system and put it in place. Other parishes might find that more of a challenge. So that's why we're saying to everybody, check with your parish, be patient, and we'll get this all worked out.
Are you concerned that because of the limit on congregants and the other restrictions, that attending Mass it's almost become a privilege to be able to be present in the church?
Well, in a sense, it's always a privilege. It's always a blessing to come to Mass, regardless of the numbers, because the Eucharist is God's gift to us. Right? It's not something that we fashion on our own. It's God's gift. It's something that we receive. But together with this, remember that it will be wonderful, obviously, to be present in the church with others, but this is not the only way in which people are able to access the Eucharist. We're making sure that through live stream technology, and by recalling the Church's own tradition of the ability to make an act of spiritual communion, then the grace of the sacrament is not excluded to those who are unable to be here for whatever reason. Maybe because they can't get in on the day that they'd like to get in, or because their health condition would recommend that they not come at all.
Can you talk a little bit about contact tracing methods that are?
Oh, yeah. Well, when people do come to church, they're going to be asked to provide their name and their contact information. This is not undertaken just to be a direct invasion of privacy for no other purpose. Of course not. It's going to be really important that if, God forbid, in the church, during a particular Mass, someone's present who does have COVID-19, even if they're not aware of it, we find out about that later, it's going to be really important to be able to track everybody else who was there quickly and easily so that they can be told that this was the case and can start the practice of their own self-isolation. It's entirely for the sake of their own safety. What people should also keep in mind is that these lists that we will make, the church owns them. They're not the property of anybody else, so they'll be protected, and they're kept on file only for 2 weeks, after which they're destroyed. So people ought not to be concerned about invasion of privacy or anything like that. Of the church unleashing this information elsewhere. It will only be to medical officials so that they can in turn contact these other people should we find out that someone had COVID-19, entirely for the sake of people's safety and good health.
How do the guidelines for the Alberta diocese compare to the Archdiocese of Vancouver, which this weekend?
They're very similar. They're very, very similar. In fact, part of the process that Bishop Grandin and I went through was not just to have our own task force just here in Alberta. We had occasion also to reach out to other dioceses and other bishops so we can compare notes. What are you doing? How do we learn from one another? Oh, that's a good idea, and so on. And so as part of that process, there was an initial sharing of drafts, and here's where we're thinking of going, and so on. We looked also at some of the guidelines coming out of the States. That's a different situation, but nevertheless can be instructive. And what I found was enormous similarity across the board. So there will be some tweaking locally to respond to local circumstances, contact information, resources available, and so on. Guidelines will differ in the ways that they are structured and presented, but when you look at the essence of the material, very, very much the same.
Are these guidelines contingent on there not being a second wave of COVID-19? I guess what I'm asking is, if there is a second wave, will there be all bets are off and the guidelines have to be changed?
Well, I think what we are looking at is a gradual review and a periodic review, regular review of these guidelines as we move into the future. So these guidelines are written to correspond with stage 1 and align with what the medical officials have given us precisely for stage 1. As the province moves into stage 2 and 3 and so on, then we have to take a look at our guidelines and how do they need to be adjusted accordingly. And the reverse would be true also. If in the future we find that there's a second and third wave, and then we hear from our medical officials whose expertise we really, really trust, if we hear from them that we need to take a step back, we'll do that. So what we are doing with our guidelines is just what's appropriate for each stage as we continue to be consulting and dialoguing with medical officials. Now, I think we all have to be very, very attuned to the fact that a second wave is possible if we're not careful. So that's why we've given very close, careful attention to these guidelines. That's why we're asking everybody to follow them closely. And it's why we're insisting to the parishes that if you cannot follow them fully, you simply do not return to the public celebration of Mass. Because of that possibility of the second wave, we all have to be on guard. The resumption of Mass at this point in time is not a return to normal. That's very, very far from it. So we just have to be cautious and vigilant.
And do you anticipate that the return to normal won't be until there's a vaccine?
That'd be my guess, although I don't know. That's probably within the purview of the medical experts to make that kind of a call. But it seems clear to me, on the basis of what I'm observing and hearing, that it will be quite a while yet before we are back to full churches. I want that to happen as soon as anybody wants that to happen. I just miss being with the people and being able to celebrate fully, worthily, joyfully, the way that we're accustomed to. But these are the circumstances in which we find ourselves. And just have to keep accompanying this with prayer that the Lord is going to bring this pandemic to an end and let us get back to what we know and love, the full celebration of the Eucharist.
Do you think that once the pandemic is over, that some people may prefer virtual Mass as an option?
Could be. It could be. Although, well, we'll see. We'll see, because the very people that are committed to following Mass through live stream are the very people that are in touch with us and saying, when are we getting back to church? You know, they're missing the physical touch of the Eucharist. They're missing that opportunity to be together with their brothers and sisters in the faith. It's awakening a hunger. Now, there's always a possibility, I suppose, that people get used to the convenience of it and so on. But at a certain point, we may just have to say, you know, this isn't the normal way we do things. You know, the Lord made himself physically present to us, right? In the incarnation. He was tangible, he's visible. And what, I think I mentioned this in another video, what St. Leo the Great said is that what was visible in the Lord during his earthly journey has passed into the mysteries, by which he means passed into the sacraments. Jesus wants the physical touch given to us, that he gives to us in the sacraments. And so to deliberately separate ourselves from that, if we're able to come to church, is certainly not in accord with the Lord's intention when he instituted the sacraments.
How difficult has the past couple of months been for you personally? The task force, the upheaval that the pandemic has caused?
Yeah. Oh, it's been difficult, challenging in a host of ways. I've found myself smiling a couple of times because when I look at the news or read reports, people talking about all this time on their hand, what are they going to do, what are they going to do? I've been talking to some other bishops, and I don't think we've been busier than during this particular time, because there's so much to try and get our heads around. How do we help our people? How do we assure our people? How do we direct the life of the church at a time like this, and so on? So it's been challenging in that sense. What are the different messages that we want to get out? I think the most difficult challenge, though, is being separated from our people. You know, a priest, bishop, we're ordained to be shepherds, to be with the people, to love them, to care for them, to hear for their needs, guide them, and above all, to celebrate the Mass with them. And so, to be celebrating the Mass in front of a camera. Now, I know in my mind that it's reaching thousands of people, so I'm glad about that. But, for example, on Easter Sunday, you know, preaching at a camera behind which is an empty church. That just speaks so powerfully to the abnormality of the situation, and just awakens, I think, even more deeply, not just for me, but I know for any priest, that desire to see his people again and to be with his people again. So please God, the Lord is going to make that happen for us very, very soon.
Do you know of anyone personally who has COVID-19? No, I haven't. I haven't met anybody with COVID-19.
I have a few questions. One, Your Grace, where's the discussion at in regards to the reception of catechumens and candidates, and as well as like the sacraments of initiation? First communion.
That's the next step. The key thing was to get right the celebration of Mass. So we've had this period of abstaining from public celebration of the Eucharist until we really understand what we need to be doing to stay safe. So now we've moved to establish guidelines for the safe celebration of the Eucharist. Give people a little bit of time now to get used to this, to get back into the practice. Our next step is to address the other sacraments, because I made the decision at the very beginning to put everything on hold till we know what we're doing to keep people safe. Well, that in our parishes has created a lot of backlog, right? So there's the people that were hoping to come into the church at Easter through the Easter Vigil, all the baptisms, all the first communions, all the first reconciliations, all the confirmations, weddings that have been postponed and so on. we'll have to be giving, and we will do this soon, some general guidelines for our parishes as to how to do this. But then it will be up to the parish priest to work out with their people some kind of a schedule in which they can start to get caught up on all of this, all the while staying within the restrictions that we all have to follow.
And this is the ongoing work of the task force?
No, this will be a particular diocesan
Okay.
task, because the task force itself was just to provide these provincial guidelines with respect to the celebration of the Eucharist.
Is that task force still meeting?
No, we've done our job. The guidelines have been finished, and so the task force no longer meets.
My other question, Grace, was as there's no singing involved in the reinstatement of public mass because of the restrictions on that. How does that affect because in mass, of course, everyone responds at the same time to the priest. Does that affect the responses in mass, and particularly like the creed?
No, because the issue is precisely with singing.
Okay.
Because as long as we're speaking, if we have the appropriate physical distancing, we're good.
Okay.
But singing is such that it projects the droplets beyond that 2 meter, at least very easily could, right? That's what the medical advice is saying to us. So if that's the case, if there is singing, then it may go beyond those droplets, beyond that physical distancing, and put others at risk. So the safest thing at this stage 1, no congregational singing.
And just to clarify, does that singing apply to, can you have one person singing or no singing?
No, we decided at this stage no singing at all. One of the things we wondered about in our minds, well, what about a cantor, But even a cantor singing, you'd have to make sure that there's much more than just the 2 meters between himself or herself and the nearest people. In a place like the Basilica, you could do that. In some of our smaller churches, you couldn't. So again, for the sake of fairness and equity, at this early stage, let's just say no singing at all. It's not something that I'm pleased about, obviously. Music, singing, that's so much part of a beautiful celebration of the Eucharist. But it's where we are now, and we pray that we'll get back to some degree of singing before long.
Oh, this is another one came to my mind, is the offertory.
Yeah, there won't be any procession with gifts.
Okay.
No.
And the basket, I forget what that's called specifically.
For a collection?
Collection, yeah.
No, there's no passing of that. We'll have to put in, the whole idea is to avoid all the handling of things, right? So everything's up in the sanctuary ahead of time. There's no servers of handing things back and forth. No procession with the gifts. And they'll have to, in every parish, establish one place that's visible and secure for people to make their donations. No passing of any collection basket.
Gotcha.
How's the response been? I know you don't have specifics, but even anecdotally, how has the response been to online donations?
I'm hearing varied reports of that. Again, it's all anecdotal. Some parishes are saying that maybe they're at about 2/3 of what they would normally get. Others are saying, no, it's far less. We're only getting maybe 1/3 of our normal donations right now. So it remains a rather worrying situation, I'd have to say, to be honest. And I would continue to make that appeal that people don't forget that this is their spiritual home. Bills have to get paid, obviously, and the mission of the church must continue. So we do need those donations. Because apart from it, well, as we're already seeing in many parishes, temporary layoffs of people that are beloved colleagues are having to take place. And that dramatically impacts what we are able to do with our people.
Do you think some churches may not survive the pandemic?
That will depend on the people. I think if a parish shows that it is on the edge, as it were, then it will be incumbent upon me to sit down with the pastor and the pastoral council and say, here's your situation, make sure people are fully informed, and then what can we do about it? And that, I think people, when they see the reality, out of their love for the church, they'll step up to the plate. That's my confidence, but I think it's important to put right now that we keep the information before people's eyes and realize that these are really, really worrisome times right now. Worrisome, first of all, for the people themselves. I get that, obviously. So a lot of them lost their jobs, so their salaries have been cut back, and I get all that for sure. And I still, though, I hope people understand this. I still have to ask and make it known. And you know, the Lord, when He took even 5 loaves and 2 fish, the very, very little that a little boy could give, He multiplied it. So if people have less and less to give, so long as they still give, do it in faith, and do it with the understanding they're putting it in the hands of Jesus and asking Him to multiply it, things will happen. But the giving still has to take place.
Is there any message to people who are living in isolation and who are upset that these self-isolation measures are even in place?
I would say they're not alone in the sense of being upset, being frustrated. If you are confined to your residence and you can't get out for whatever reason, that can be a very, very trying thing. And it's easy to start to feel that maybe people have forgotten me altogether. But I don't forget, the church doesn't forget, and most importantly, God doesn't forget. No physical distancing can separate us from the love of God. Nothing can. And so I would just encourage people to keep that in mind above all else. And whenever there's any fear, any concern, any worry, give that over to the Lord, and He'll take care of things.